Welcome back, guys, to Mr. Cursed. In today's episode, I'm sharing 7 true creepy cemetery stories from Appalachian Mountains. These are the scary stories that even the locals are afraid to talk about. Real things that happened in old graveyards where something just isn't right. But before we begin, please consider subscribing. Don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends and family. I'd also love to hear where you're listening from. Thank you all for your support. It means a lot to me. Now, let's start with these spooky cemetery stories. I'm Tommy Caldwell, and I was 25 when I took the caretaker job at Moonshine Hollow Cemetery. This was back in 2018, and honestly, I needed the work. The Mackenzie family owned about 3,000 acres of mountain land up in eastern Kentucky, and they hired locals like me to help manage it all. Good jobs are hard to come by in our part of the mountains, so when old Mr. Mackenzie offered me steady pay to maintain their family burial ground, I jumped at it. The cemetery sat about 12 miles from the nearest neighbor, way up on a ridge that had been in their family since the 1800s. Most of the graves were unmarked, just field stones with names and dates carved by hand, if they had markings at all. The Mackenzie family kept the oral history of who was buried where, passed down through generations. I'd grown up hearing stories about these mountains, about the families who'd made their living running moonshine during Prohibition. My own great-grandfather had worked with some of them, back when federal agents would come through trying to bust up the stills. The work itself was simple enough: clear vegetation from around the graves, repair any damage from weather or animals, make sure the old burial sites stayed properly honored. The Mackenzies respected mountain traditions, and they took their responsibility to their ancestors seriously. I'd drive up twice a week in my pickup truck, spend 6 to 8 hours working, then check in with the family before heading home. The isolation didn't bother me much at first. I'd always been comfortable in the woods, and the pay let me help take care of my mother while staying in the community instead of moving to Lexington or Louisville looking for factory work. To be fair, I took pride in the job. These weren't just graves to me. They were part of our mountain heritage, our history. Families had lived and died on this land for over 2 centuries, and I felt honored to help preserve their memory. The first sign something was wrong came about 3 weeks into the job. I was clearing brush from around a cluster of graves near the center of the cemetery when I noticed fresh dirt scattered around some of the oldest headstones. At first I figured it was just animals. Maybe wild pigs rooting around or dogs from one of the farms down in the valley. But when I looked closer, the disturbance pattern was too deliberate. Something had been digging systematically around specific graves, all of them from families I knew had been involved in the moonshine trade. The excavation marks were deep and precise, like whatever made them was looking for something particular. I mentioned it to Mrs. Mackenzie when I checked in that evening. She got this strange look on her face, kind of worried but not surprised, if that makes sense. She asked me to describe exactly which graves had been disturbed, and when I told her, she nodded like she'd expected it. That's when she told me about the Still Guardian legend. According to the old stories, back during Prohibition, some of the mountain families had summoned something to protect their moonshine operations from federal agents. It was supposed to be this ancient creature that lived in the deep woods, something that had been in these mountains long before white settlers arrived. The families would perform rituals to bind it to their service, and in exchange, it would kill any revenue agents who got too close to their stills. Mrs. Mackenzie explained that the creature was called the Still Guardian, and it was described as being about 9 feet tall, with bark-like skin and antlers that looked like dead tree branches. Its eyes supposedly glowed green in the dark, and it could blend so perfectly with the forest that you'd never see it coming. The thing is, the binding rituals were temporary. They had to be renewed every generation or so, and the knowledge of how to do it had been mostly lost over the decades. She thought maybe the creature was waking up again, getting restless after all these years. I have to admit I was skeptical. I believed in mountain folklore to an extent. We all grew up with those stories, but actually seeing evidence of something supernatural was different. Still, I couldn't explain the digging patterns any other way. Over the next few visits, I started finding more disturbing signs. Broken branches arranged in geometric patterns around the cemetery perimeter. scratches on tree bark that were too high and too deep to be from any normal animal. And the smell. There was this musty organic odor around the older graves, like damp earth mixed with something rotting. Then I started finding the bones. They were scattered through the woods surrounding the cemetery, always partially buried like something had cached them for later. Most were from deer and other wildlife, but some were different, bigger. I found a hiking boot with what looked like part of a leg bone still inside it, and that's when I really started to worry. I reported it to the sheriff's department, but they said they'd had reports of missing hikers in the area going back several years. People would come up to explore the old moonshine sites, and some just never came back down. The Mackenzie family seemed to know more than they were telling me. When I pressed Mrs. Mackenzie about it, she admitted that previous caretakers had reported similar incidents. A few had quit without explanation. One had simply disappeared. They found his truck at the bottom of the access road, but never found him. She said the family had always believed the still guardian was still protecting them, keeping outsiders away from their land. What they hadn't realized was that the creature's binding had been deteriorating for decades, and it was becoming independent, territorial, in a way that went beyond its original purpose. I started doing my own research, Lute. King through old family records that Mrs. Mackenzie let me borrow. The still guardian wasn't just a protector, it was a predator that had been temporarily controlled. The binding rituals were complex and dangerous, requiring blood sacrifice from someone with mountain family connections. According to what I could piece together from the old documents, the caretaker position had traditionally included managing the creature, making sure it stayed bound to its protective role instead of hunting freely through the mountains. Looking back now, I probably should have quit right then. But I kept thinking about my mother, about the families down in the valley who didn't know there was something hunting in these woods. The creature's territory was expanding. I'd found evidence of kills closer and closer to the populated areas, and it was only a matter of time before it started picking off people from the community. The old binding was failing, and someone needed to renew it, or the thing would eventually make its way down to where innocent people could get hurt. The ritual itself was described in detail in one of the old journals. It required the caretaker to confront the creature directly, to offer themselves as a sacrifice while performing the binding ceremony. The blood sacrifice would reestablish the creature's connection to the cemetery, containing it to that specific area instead of letting it roam freely through the entire mountain range. Previous caretakers had performed this duty when necessary, giving their lives to protect the community. It was part of the job I'd never been told about, a responsibility that came with the position whether I'd agreed to it or not. I won't lie, I was terrified, but I also understood that this was bigger than just me. If the still guardian kept expanding its hunting ground, it would eventually threaten every family in the valley. I had a choice between protecting myself and protecting people who trusted me to do my job properly. When I really thought about it, there wasn't much of a choice at all. I prepared for the ritual on a cold October night, gathering the materials described in the old documents: candles made from animal fat, salt from the creek beds, iron tools that had belonged to the original moonshine families. The ceremony had to be performed at the center of the cemetery, right where the oldest graves were clustered. I set everything up just after midnight when the creature was supposed to be most active. It showed up before I even finished the preparations. I heard it moving through the trees first, this heavy, deliberate crashing that got closer and closer. When it finally stepped into the cemetery clearing, I understood why the old stories described it the way they did. The thing was massive, easily 9 feet tall, with skin that looked like tree bark and antlers that spread out like dead branches. Its eyes were these bright green points of light, and when it looked at me, I felt like I was staring at something that had been hunting in these mountains since before my people ever arrived. The creature studied me for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. It seemed curious about what I was doing, like it recognized the ritual preparations but wasn't sure what to expect. I started the binding ceremony, speaking the words I'd memorized from the old journal, focusing on the idea of protection rather than predation. The still guardian began to resist almost immediately, making this low growling sound and pacing around the edge of the clearing like a caged animal. The binding required me to cut my palm and let the blood drip onto the central grave while maintaining eye contact with the creature. The moment my blood hit the stone, the still guardian went into a fury. It charged at me with supernatural speed, but I kept the ritual going, kept speaking the binding words, even as it slashed at me with claws that were more like broken tree branches. The pain was incredible, but I knew if I stopped the ceremony, the creature would kill me and continue hunting through the mountains. I could feel my life force being pulled into the binding, the traditional sacrifice that was necessary to reestablish control over the creature. The old caretakers had known this was how it would end for them, and they'd accepted it as part of their duty to the community. As I felt myself getting weaker, I watched the still guardian's fury gradually change to something like recognition. The creature was remembering its original purpose, its connection to the cemetery and the families buried there. The binding worked. I managed to complete the ritual before losing consciousness, and the creature retreated to the deeper parts of the cemetery property. When the Mackenzie family found me the next morning, I was barely alive, but the still guardian was contained again. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital, and I never fully recovered from the injuries. But the important thing was that the creature stopped hunting in the wider mountain area. It went back to protecting the cemetery itself, staying within the traditional boundaries instead of expanding its territory toward the populated valleys. I can't work as a caretaker anymore. The physical damage was too severe, but the Mackenzie family takes care of me now, makes sure I have everything I need. They found a new caretaker who understands the full scope of the job, someone who knows about the still guardian and how to maintain the binding if it ever starts to weaken again. The creature is still up there, protecting the old Moonshine family's graves, but it's not hunting innocent people anymore. I still don't go up to that cemetery, even during the day. Sometimes I dream about those green eyes, about the way the still guardian looked at me during the binding ritual, but I sleep better knowing that family time, as in the valley, are safe, that something ancient and predatory is contained where it belongs instead of stalking through the mountains looking for prey. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the right thing. That's what mountain people do. We take care of each other, even when it costs us everything. Back when I was 28, I ran a small landscaping business out of my garage in eastern Tennessee. Nothing fancy, just me, my truck, and whatever equipment I could afford to keep running. My name's Jake Morrison, and honestly, I was barely scraping by. The economy was still rough in 2012, and most folks weren't exactly throwing money around for yard work. When the County Historical Society called about a big restoration job at some old cemetery up in the mountains, I jumped at it without asking too many questions. $15,000 for 3 weeks of work. That was more than I usually made in 3 months. I needed that money bad. Truck payments were behind. My brush cutter was held together with duct tape, and my wife Sarah was pregnant with our first kid. This job would set us up right for when the baby came. The cemetery was called Crying Woman Cemetery, which should have been my first red flag, but I figured every old mountain graveyard had some spooky name. It dated back to the 1840s, tucked away about 8 miles from the nearest neighbor on a winding dirt road that my GPS could barely find. The Historical Society wanted it cleaned up before some big preservation ceremony they were planning. Clear the overgrowth, repair damaged headstones, install proper drainage, reseed the grass. Basically bring it back from being swallowed by the forest. I drove up there on a Monday morning to survey the site, and I'll admit the place was pretty impressive in a creepy sort of way. Maybe 2 acres of headstones scattered under these massive old oak trees, some of them tilted at weird angles from tree roots growing underneath. The wrought iron fence around the perimeter was mostly intact, though rust had eaten through parts of it. What struck me right away was how many of the graves were marked "beloved husband," with dates showing the wives had outlived their men by decade. So I'm talking 20, 30, sometimes 40 years. That seemed like a lot, even for the 1800s. The local guy who met me there to hand over the key, an old-timer named Carl who worked for the Historical Society, mentioned something about the cemetery's legend while we walked around. Said the mountain folks used to tell stories about something called the Widowmaker that hunted in these parts, killed married men and left their wives to raise the children alone. I nodded politely, But honestly, I was more focused on figuring out which trees needed trimming and where to start with the headstone repairs. Legends don't pay the bills. The work itself started normal enough. I set up early Tuesday morning with my chainsaw, brush cutter, and a truck-mounted water tank for cleaning the stones. The plan was to work alone to keep costs down and maximize my profit. 3 weeks seemed like plenty of time if I put in full days. The cemetery was peaceful, actually, quiet except for birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. I spent that first morning cutting back the worst of the overgrowth and making piles of brush to haul away later. It was around lunchtime when I noticed the claw marks on the trees. Deep gouges in the bark about 7 feet up, too high for a bear to reach standing on its hind legs. The marks formed a rough circle around the entire cemetery, like something had been marking territory. The scratches looked fresh too. Sap was still bleeding from some of them. I figured maybe it was a really big cat, though I'd never heard of mountain lions getting that large. The smell hit me next. This thick, musky odor that reminded me of a dog that had been rolling in something dead, but stronger, and with this weird sweetness underneath that made my stomach turn. It seemed to come and go with the wind, strongest near the back corner where most of the husband graves were clustered. By Wednesday, my equipment started acting up. The chainsaw blade went completely dull after just an hour of use, which made no sense since I'd put a fresh chain on it that morning. The brush cutter's engine kept fouling out for no reason I could figure. I've been working with small engines my whole adult life, and this wasn't normal wear and tear. It was like something was deliberately sabotaging my tools. That's when I started feeling watched. You know that prickly feeling on the back of your neck when someone's staring at you? I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, shadows between the trees that seemed too large and moved wrong. Not like a person walking, but more like something flowing through the forest. Whenever I'd turn to look directly, nothing was there. Thursday morning, I found my tools had been moved overnight. Not just scattered around, arranged in deliberate patterns. My rake, shovel, and pruning shears laid out in a perfect triangle pointing toward the section with the most husband graves. My water hoses coiled into tight spirals. Someone or something had been studying my equipment while I was gone. I started finding deer carcasses around the cemetery grounds. Always the same injury. Neck snapped clean, but the body untouched. No bite marks, no signs of feeding. Just killed and left to rot. The positioning was weird too, like they'd been placed deliberately along what I was starting to think of as a boundary line. Friday, I got my first clear look at the tracks. The ground near the back fence was soft from a recent rain, and whatever made these prints was walking upright like a person. But the stride length was impossible. Had to be 8 feet between steps. The prints themselves were roughly human-shaped but larger than any boot I'd ever seen, with claw marks at the toe ends. I should have left then. Any sensible person would have packed up and driven home. But I needed that 15 grand, and I'd already put a week of work into the place. Sarah was counting on that money for the baby, and I couldn't just walk away from Tulon. The biggest payday I'd ever landed. Saturday, I decided to work late to make up for lost time. The sun was getting low when I heard footsteps in the leaves behind me. Heavy, deliberate steps that stopped every time I paused my work. I grabbed a flashlight from my truck and swept it across the tree line. 2 yellow eyes reflected back at me from about 8 feet off the ground. They watched me for maybe 10 seconds before disappearing deeper into the woods. That night, I researched everything I could find about Crying Woman Cemetery and the Widowmaker legend. Turns out there was a pattern going back to when the cemetery was first established. Married men who worked alone in that area, surveyors, loggers, caretakers, had been disappearing regularly for over 170 years. Always the same story. They'd be found with broken necks, and their widows would be left to fend for themselves. The historical records were spotty, but I found references to previous landscapers and groundskeepers who'd taken jobs at the cemetery. Most had just vanished from normal life after a few months, became hermits living up in the mountains. The few who'd been interviewed claimed they'd made some kind of arrangement with whatever lived in those woods. Monday of my second week, it finally showed itself completely. I was replacing a broken headstone when I heard branches snapping behind me. I turned around, and there it was. 8 feet tall, covered in matted black fur, standing between 2 oak trees about 30 yards away. Its proportions were almost human, but stretched wrong, like someone had taken a person and made them too tall, too broad through the shoulders. The face was the worst part. Intelligent yellow eyes in something that might have been human once but wasn't anymore. It didn't attack. That's what still bothers me. It just stood there watching me work, occasionally tilting its head, like it was trying to understand what I was doing. When I'd move to a different section of the cemetery, it would follow along the tree line, keeping pace but staying in the forest. Over. The next few days, it got bolder, started making sounds, not quite growling, not quite talking, but something in between. It would gesture toward the husband graves, then toward me, then back to the graves. I started to understand it was trying to communicate something. By the end of that week, I figured out what it wanted. The thing, the widowmaker, I guess, wasn't just some mindless monster. It was territorial, but smart. It had been hunting married men in this area for generations, and it was offering me a deal. I could keep working, keep living, as long as I helped it find new victims. The choice was simple: become its next victim or become its partner. I chose to live. It taught me how to identify the right targets. Married men who worked alone, who wouldn't be missed immediately if they disappeared. Hikers who wore wedding rings. Hunters who mentioned wives back home. Contractors like myself taking isolated jobs. I'd scout them out during my regular business, then pass along information. I watched it work. The creature was efficient. One quick movement and the neck would snap. Clean, quiet, over in seconds. The wives never knew what really happened, just that their husbands were gone and they were suddenly raising children alone. At first, I told myself I was just surviving, that I didn't have a choice. But after the first few kills, something changed in me. I stopped feeling guilty about it, started seeing it as natural, like a wolf culling deer. These men were just prey, and I was helping maintain the balance. I never did finish that cemetery restoration job. Told the Historical Society there were structural issues that made the work unsafe. They paid me for the time I'd already put in, which was enough to keep Sarah happy. She never questioned why I started refusing certain jobs, why I'd only work in areas where I knew the widowmaker couldn't follow. That was 8 years ago. Sarah and I divorced 3 years back. She said I'd changed, become distant and cold. She wasn't wrong. Our son lives with her now, which is probably for the best. I still run my landscaping business, but it's more of a cover now. My real job is scouting for the widowmaker. I've gotten good at it over the years. Social media makes it easy to find married men planning solo trips to the mountains. Online forums where guys post about wanting to get away from their families for a weekend. Dating apps where recently divorced men mention missing their ex-wives. They all make perfect victims. The creature and I have an understanding now. I provide information. It provides protection. I'm safe as long as I'm useful. And there's always another husband who thinks he can handle the wilderness alone. Always another man who doesn't understand what's waiting for him in those dark mountains. I don't talk about this with anyone. Can't really. Who would believe it? But sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I wonder what I've become. How many widows I've helped create. How many children I've left without fathers. Then I remember those yellow eyes watching me in the cemetery, and I know I made the only choice I could. In these mountains, you're either predator or prey. And I chose to live. My name's Amanda Torres, and I'm 33 years old. I make my living photographing old cemeteries. I know that sounds weird, but there's actually a decent market for it. Victorian memorial art, historical preservation societies, families looking for pictures of ancestors' graves. I'd been doing it for about 6 years when this happened, had a few books published, some gallery shows. It was niche work, but it paid the bills, and I genuinely loved it. There's something beautiful about these old places, the way nature slowly reclaims the elaborate stone monuments, how the light falls through century-old trees onto weathered angels and crosses. I specialized in places most photographers wouldn't bother with: remote mountain cemeteries, forgotten family plots, places where the dead had been resting undisturbed for generations. The Whispering Oaks Cemetery job came through the Appalachian Historical Preservation Society in late September 2014. They wanted a complete photographic documentation of the cemetery before they started restoration work. Apparently, it was one of the most intact Victorian cemeteries in eastern Kentucky, but it was deteriorating fast. The pay was good, better than usual, and they were giving me a month to complete the project. The cemetery sat on about 15 acres of mountainside, established in 1847, filled with elaborate monuments and mausoleums that would have cost fortunes back in the day. I drove up from Lexington on a Tuesday morning, my Subaru packed with camera equipment, camping gear, and enough supplies for a week-long stay. The Preservation Society had arranged for me to use a small cabin about 2 miles from the cemetery. Apparently, it belonged to one of the board members' families. Hadn't been used much in recent years. The cabin was basic but clean, with electricity and running water, perfect for my needs. I like working alone anyway. Imagery photography requires patience, waiting for the right light, the perfect moment when shadows fall just right across a weathered inscription. You can't rush it. The first few days went exactly as planned. Whispering Oaks was everything the Preservation Society had promised. Rows of ornate Victorian monuments, elaborate family mausoleums with stained glass windows, angel statues so detailed you could see individual feathers carved in marble. I spent hours setting up shots, waiting for the light to hit each monument perfectly. My routine was simple: arrive at sunrise, work until noon, break for lunch back at the cabin, return for the afternoon golden hour, then review and organize photos in the evening. It was on the 4th day that I first noticed something odd. I was reviewing the day's shots on my laptop that evening when I came across a series of photographs I didn't remember taking. They were good shots, really good actually. Professional quality work showing the cemetery's main mausoleum from angles I hadn't explored yet. The composition was perfect, the lighting exactly right, but I had no memory of taking them. I figured maybe I'd been so focused I'd just forgotten. It happens when you're in the zone. Muscle memory taking over. The next morning I found my camera had been moved. Not far, just from the kitchen table where I always left it to the counter by the window. The settings had been changed too. Someone had adjusted the aperture and ISO to settings I never used. I lived alone, the cabin was isolated, and I distinctly remembered locking the door the night before. But the lock was old. Maybe it didn't catch properly. Mountain cabins aren't exactly Fort Knox. That's when the memory gaps started. I'd find completed photo series on my camera that I had no recollection of shooting. Not just 1 or 2 shots, but entire artistic compositions, 40, 50s. Thai photographs of cemetery sections I hadn't visited yet. The work was flawless, better than my usual stuff, honestly. The technical execution was perfect, and whoever had taken them understood my artistic vision better than I did sometimes. The style was unmistakably mine, but enhanced somehow, like someone had taken my techniques and perfected them. Other people started noticing too. Mrs. Henderson from the Historical Society called to say a visitor had mentioned seeing me working in the cemetery on Wednesday afternoon around 2 p.m. Problem was, I'd been back at the cabin Wednesday afternoon, uploading photos and eating lunch. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no messages. I'd been alone in the cabin, but someone matching my description had been photographing monuments 2 miles away at the same time. The feeling of being watched started around day 7. Not the normal awareness you get working alone in remote places. This was different. Calculated. Like someone was studying me, learning my routines, my techniques, the way I approached each shot. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision while I worked, but when I turned to look, nothing. Just weathered headstones and morning shadows. On day 9, I saw myself. I was setting up a shot near the cemetery's eastern wall when I spotted movement near the main mausoleum about 100 yards away. Someone was crouched behind a large angel statue, camera raised, shooting the same monument I'd photographed the day before. The figure stood up, and even from that distance I could see it was me. Same height, same build, same long dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, same red jacket I was wearing, same professional camera setup. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds just watching myself work. The duplicate moved exactly like I did. Same careful positioning, same way of tilting her head to check the viewfinder, same methodical approach to adjusting the tripod. It was like watching a recording of myself, except I was standing right there. When she finished the shot and began walking to a "New position," I called out. My voice echoed off the stone monuments, but the figure didn't react, just kept walking with that familiar purposeful stride, equipment bag slung over her shoulder, exactly the way I carried mine. I ran toward the mausoleum, dodging headstones and marble angels, but by the time I reached the spot where I'd seen myself, no one was there. Just my footprints in the soft earth and a warm spot on the ground where someone had been kneeling. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that perfect artistic technique in the mysterious photographs, how the duplicate seemed to understand my vision better than I did. The next morning I found new photos on my camera again. Shots of monuments I planned to photograph that day, taken from the exact angles I'd been considering. But these weren't just good shots. They were masterpieces. The composition, the lighting, the artistic vision, everything was elevated, perfected. It was my style, but somehow more than I'd ever achieved. The Preservation Society started requesting specific shots from the enhanced work. They'd call asking for more photos like the ones in my recent submission, photos I hadn't submitted, photos I didn't remember taking. My gallery contact emailed about a series she'd seen on my website that captured a new level of artistic maturity. I checked my website. The photos were there, credited to me, but I had no memory of uploading them. Friends started commenting on how much my work had improved lately. My technique seemed more confident, they said, more artistic vision. Even my personality seemed enhanced in their interactions with the duplicate. She was apparently funnier, more engaging, easier to talk to than I was. When I'd call to catch up, they'd mention conversations we'd supposedly had recently. Conversations I had no memory of. The duplicate was replacing me, and he was doing a better job of being me than I was. I started finding evidence of her everywhere. Personal items moved around the cabin, rearranged in ways that somehow made more sense than how I'd left them. My equipment cleaned and maintained better than I usually managed. Even my clothes seemed to fit better after she'd worn them, like she'd figured out the optimal way to arrange everything. By the third week, I began to wonder who was the real Amanda Torres. The duplicate demonstrated artistic abilities I'd only dreamed of achieving. She had my memories, my training, my experience, but somehow refined and perfected. She understood my artistic vision better than I did and executed it flawlessly. She was funnier, more personable, more successful. In every measurable way, she was a superior version of me. I stopped trying to assert my identity as the real Amanda. What was the point? The duplicate was everything I'd always wanted to be. A better photographer, a better artist, a better person. She deserved my life more than I did. She'd earned it through superior execution of everything I'd always tried to accomplish. The final photographs I remember taking were of myself in the cabin's bathroom mirror. I wanted some record of the original Amanda Torres before she became irrelevant. But when I checked the camera later, the photos showed the enhanced version instead. Her smile more confident, her artistic eye more assured. Even in my final act of self-documentation, she'd superseded me. I stopped going to the cemetery after that. The project was already completed anyway. The duplicate had finished the entire documentation weeks ahead of schedule, producing work that exceeded anything in my portfolio. The Preservation Society was thrilled with the results. My gallery was planning a major exhibition of the Whispering Oaks series. I don't know exactly when I stopped existing, and she became the only Amanda Torres. The transition was gradual, like consciousness slowly dimming. I remember less and less of what it felt like to be the original. Her memories became the official record, her personality, the authentic one. The enhanced Amanda Torres was simply the real one. That was 4 years ago. Amanda Torres is doing very well now. Her cemetery photography has gained national recognition, her books are bestsellers, her gallery exhibitions sell out. She's expanded into other forms of artistic documentation, all of it superior to anything the original ever produced. She has better relationships, a more successful career, a more confident personality. I hear she's never returned to Whispering Oak Cemetery. Smart choice. No telling what other photographers might discover there, working alone among the weathered monuments and watching shadows. Sometimes the perfect shot finds you instead of the other way around. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the perfect shot improves on the original. I was 34 when I started finding empty coffins at Bone Hollow Cemetery, and honestly, I still don't sleep right thinking about it. My name's Marcus Webb, and I'd been running the family funeral home for about 6 years by then. Third generation in the business. My granddad started Webb Family Funeral Home back in 1948, and we'd built up a solid reputation serving the mountain communities around eastern Kentucky. People trusted us with their loved ones, you know? That meant everything to families who didn't have much else. The whole thing started in late September of 2008. I remember because we'd just buried Mrs. Henderson's husband, and she'd specifically asked us to check on the gravesite after a week or so. She was worried about the settling, wanted to make sure everything looked proper. When I drove up to Bone Hollow that Thursday morning, I could tell something was wrong before I even got out of the truck. The dirt over Harold Henderson's grave looked disturbed, not settled like it should have been, but churned up like something had been digging. I figured it was probably kids messing around, maybe looking for jewelry or something valuable. Happens more than people think, unfortunately. But when I got the sheriff out there and we opened that coffin, it was completely empty. Not just the valuables gone, Harold Henderson's entire body was missing. The coffin was intact, the liner was perfect, but there wasn't so much as a bone fragment left behind. No signs of decomposition. Nothing. Just gone. That's when I started checking the other recent burials. Found 2 more empty coffins from the past 6 months. Same thing every time. Perfect coffins, but no remains whatsoever. The weird part was, all the older graves were untouched. Whatever was happening, it was recent. I installed security cameras, started making regular patrols up there. Had to do something. Family. Us were starting to talk, and our reputation was on the line. 3 generations of Webbs had never lost a body, and I wasn't about to be the first. But those cameras kept malfunctioning, and I kept finding more evidence that this wasn't just vandalism. There were bone fragments scattered around the empty graves, small pieces. But when I looked at them closer, they were gnawed on, chewed. The bite marks didn't match any animal I knew of. The tooth impressions were too big, too human-looking, but wrong somehow. Like a person's jaw, but stretched out longer. That's when I found the tunnels. They started right at the edge of the cemetery and disappeared into the tree line. Multiple entrances, all about the size a person could crawl through, but the dimensions felt off. Too wide, too tall, like they were made for something with longer limbs than a normal human. I followed one about 20 feet before my flashlight started flickering, and I got this overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I started mapping out the tunnel entrances I could find. There were at least a dozen, forming a network that seemed to cover the entire mountainside. Whatever was living down there had claimed a lot of territory, and I kept finding more bone caches deeper in the woods, human remains sorted by type, organized like someone was collecting them. Femurs in one pile, ribs in another. It wasn't random feeding. This thing was methodical. The local sheriff listened to my theories for about 5 minutes before he started giving me those looks. You know the ones, like maybe the stress of the funeral business was getting to me. But I kept investigating on my own, and that's when things got personal. I started noticing movement in my peripheral vision during my cemetery visits. Shadows that didn't match the trees, shapes that moved wrong when I wasn't looking directly at them. My truck would smell all different when I got back to it, musty, like old basement air mixed with something organic and sour. Something was following me, studying me. Then my phone lines at the funeral home got cut twice in 1 week. Found claw marks on my truck tires, deep gouges that looked deliberate. Whatever this thing was, it was intelligent enough to know I was a threat to its food source. And it was doing something about it. The final confrontation happened on a Tuesday night in late October. I'd gone up to check on a fresh burial. The Garrison family had insisted on extra security after word got around about the missing bodies. I was documenting everything with my camera when I heard something moving in the tree line. 8 feet tall, easy. Bipedal, but the proportions were all wrong. arms that hung down past where knees should be, a torso that looked almost human but stretched vertically. The head was the worst part, elongated like a skull that had been pulled at both ends, filled with teeth that were designed for crushing bone. The skin looked rough, scaled, like a snake that had learned to walk upright. I grabbed a shovel from the groundskeeper's shed and tried to fight it off, but this thing was stronger than anything I'd ever encountered. Its claws opened up 3 deep cuts across my chest, and I could feel myself getting weaker as the blood soaked through my shirt. It wasn't trying to kill me quickly. It was hurting me, forcing me away from the cemetery and toward those tunnel entrances. I ended up underground, lost in that maze of passages, bleeding and disoriented. The creature knew exactly where it was going. It led me to a main chamber that was filled with human skeletons, dozens of them, arranged like trophies. Some were old, yellowed with age, but others looked fresh. And in the corner, barely alive, were 2 people I recognized from missing person reports. A hiker who'd disappeared 3 weeks earlier, and a local hunter who'd been missing since August. I tried to help them, tried to get them moving toward what I hoped was an exit, but the creature came back. It was angry now, defensive of its territory and its food supply. That's when I realized this thing had been feeding on our buried dead for months. And when that wasn't enough, it had started hunting the living. The creature caught me in that chamber. No way out, nowhere to run. I watched it begin its feeding process with the other victims first, methodical and careful, keeping them conscious as long as possible. All my professional knowledge about death, all those years in the funeral business, none of it prepared me for becoming prey myself. I became part of its collection that night. Just another skeleton in its underground trophy room. The creature added my remains to the others, sorted and organized like all the rest. My body was never found, never identified. As far as anyone knows, Marcus Webb just disappeared one night in October 2008. My younger brother took over the funeral home. Business continued as usual. The families got their closure, their proper burials, their peace of mind. But that thing is still out there, still hunting, still feeding in that cemetery. The people living in those mountains have no idea what's lurking under their feet, and I can't warn them. Bone Hollow Cemetery is still operating. They never did figure out what happened to those missing bodies, and they never found me. The creature learned to be more careful after my investigation, but it's still there, still collecting bones, still adding to its underground museum of death. If you ever find yourself in eastern Kentucky, near the mountains around Pike County, stay away from that cemetery after dark. And if you hear tunneling sounds under the ground, or smell that musty, organic odor in the air, get out of there fast. Don't try to investigate like I did. Some things are better left alone, even if it means letting other people walk unknowingly into danger. The Webb family, F. Funeral Home still serves those mountain communities. They still have that reputation for caring, for treating people's loved ones with respect, but they have no idea that some of those bodies they bury never stay buried, and they never will, because the only person who could have told them is hanging in pieces in a cave system that the authorities will never find. That creature is patient, it's intelligent, and it's still hungry. Back when I was 26, I was digging graves for $12 an hour at a place called Screaming Pines Cemetery up in the West Virginia mountains. I'm Danny Kowalski, and I'm 37 now, working a desk job at the county courthouse because my legs don't work the same anymore. This was back in 2009, right after I got laid off from the factory where I'd been welding for 3 years. My wife Sarah was pregnant with our first kid, and we needed steady money coming in. The grave digging job wasn't much, but it was all I could find that paid regularly. County work, you know, benefits and everything. Most people don't realize somebody has to dig the holes before they put the casket in the ground. That somebody was me, and honestly, I took pride in doing it right. These were people's family members, and they deserved a proper resting place. Screaming Pines wasn't your normal cemetery. It was way up in the mountains, established back in the 1890s for coal miners and their families. The county kept it going even after the mines closed, but barely. I was the only employee most of the time, just me and a truck full of hand tools. No fancy equipment, no power digger, just shovels, picks, a measuring tape, and my back. The soil up there was rocky as hell, full of roots and chunks of slate that would crack your shovel if you hit them wrong. It took me a full day to dig one grave properly, sometimes longer if I hit a bad patch of rock or if the weather wasn't cooperating. The cemetery itself was isolated, maybe 15 miles from the nearest town on a winding mountain road that half the time was more mud than asphalt. Cell phone service was spotty at best. Most days I wouldn't see another living soul from sunrise to sunset. Just me, the headstones, and the mountain silence. The graves went back over a century, some of them so old you couldn't read the names anymore. There was a section in two, back where they'd buried miners who died in a cave-in back in 1892. Mass grave, they called it, though nobody knew exactly where it was located anymore. The records from back then weren't great. I'd been working there about 6 months when I started noticing the sinkholes. Small ones at first, just little depressions in the ground near some of the older graves. I figured it was normal settling, maybe old caskets collapsing or something. But they kept appearing, and they were getting bigger. More concerning was the fresh dirt I'd find scattered around in the mornings, like somebody had been digging overnight. Problem was, there was no reason for anyone else to be digging up there. No new burials scheduled, no maintenance work planned. Just me and whatever was moving that earth around. The first time I found one of my tools buried, I thought maybe I'd just forgotten where I'd left it. You work alone long enough, you start doubting yourself sometimes. But when I found my good shovel buried 3 feet down in a random spot near the old section, that got my attention. Someone or something had deliberately put it there. The hole was too small for a person to have dug comfortably, maybe 2 feet wide and perfectly round, like someone with smaller hands had done the work. That's when I started paying closer attention to what was happening around me during the day. And that's when I realized I wasn't working alone at all. The sounds started small. Scratching noises coming from underground while I was digging. At first I thought it might be tree roots rubbing against each other, or maybe some kind of animal burrowing. But the scratching followed a pattern, and it seemed to respond to my digging. When I'd stop to rest, the scratching would stop. When I'd start digging again, it would start up too, like something was keeping pace with me from below. I started finding bones that didn't belong. Human bones, but not from any grave I'd dug. They'd show up at the edge of my work sites, arranged in little piles like someone was leaving me presents. Old bones, yellowed, with age, but some of them had fresh marks on them. Gnaw marks, like something had been chewing on them recently. The tunnels were what really got my attention, though. Small openings, maybe 3 feet across, that would appear overnight in different spots around the cemetery. They went straight down into the mountain, deeper than my flashlight could reach. The dirt around the edges was packed hard, like whatever was digging had been at it for a long time. And the smell coming out of those holes. It was like wet earth and old meat, with something else underneath that I couldn't identify. Something that made my stomach turn. I should have quit then. Sarah was on me about finding something safer anyway, especially with the baby coming. But we needed the money, and honestly, I was getting curious. I'd always been the type to want to understand things, to figure out problems instead of walking away from them. So I kept going to work, kept digging graves, and kept watching those holes get bigger and more numerous. That's when I started seeing it during the day. Just glimpses at first, movement in my peripheral vision when I was focused on digging. Something pale and quick, ducking back into one of the tunnel openings when I'd turn to look. About the size of a kid, but moving wrong. Too fast, too fluid, like it was more comfortable underground than on the surface. The day it finally came for me, I was working on a grave about 50 yards from the old miners section. It was late afternoon, getting close to quitting time, and I was maybe 4 feet down when I heard the digging underneath me get louder, more urgent. I stopped working and listened, and I could tell whatever was down there was digging upward now, heading straight for the bottom of the grave I was standing in. I should have climbed out right then. Should have grabbed my tools and run. But I was tired of being curious, and I was tired of being scared. So I kept digging, and I waited to see what would happen. I didn't have to wait long. The bottom of the grave just collapsed. 1 second I was standing on solid ground. The next I was falling through empty space into a tunnel system I hadn't even known was there. I landed hard on my shoulder. and in the dim light filtering down from above, I got my first clear look at what had been sharing the cemetery with me. It was about 4 feet tall, pale as moonlight, with arms that were too long for its body. Its hands ended in claws that looked like they'd been shaped by years of digging through rock and dirt. Its eyes were huge and dark, adapted for living in places where the sun never reached. And it was muscled in a way that told me this thing spent its life doing hard physical work underground. It didn't attack right away. It just crouched there in its tunnel, studying me like I was some kind of interesting specimen that had fallen into its territory. Then it opened its mouth, and I saw teeth that were designed for tearing meat, and I knew I was in serious trouble. The fight wasn't fair. I was in its space, using its rules, and it knew every inch of the tunnel system while I could barely see. But I had reach on it, and I had tools. When it came at me with those claws, I caught it in the chest with the handle of my shovel and sent it sprawling backward into the tunnel wall. That's when it got angry. It came at me again, faster this time, and those claws raked across my thigh before I could get my guard up. I felt the skin part and the warmth of blood running down my leg. I swung the shovel like a baseball bat and caught it in the head, but it barely slowed down. This thing was built for fighting in close quarters, and it was stronger than it looked. We went back and forth like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minds. Utes. It would dart in, try to get those claws into something vital, and I'd drive it back with the shovel or the pick. The tunnel was too low for me to swing properly, and I was bleeding. From half a dozen cuts by the time I managed to back it into a corner where it couldn't maneuver. That's when I got lucky. It lunged at me one more time, probably going for my throat. And I got the point of the pickup just in time. Went right through its skull, just above the left eye. It dropped like a stone and didn't get back up. I climbed out of that hole as fast as my injured legs would carry me, threw my tools in the truck, and drove straight to the hospital. Told them I'd had an accident with my equipment, that I'd fallen into an old mining shaft. They stitched me up and sent me home, but the damage to my legs was permanent. Nerve damage, they said. I'd never be able to do physical labor again. The county sent someone else out to Screaming Pines to finish the grave I'd been working on. They found the collapsed bottom, but the tunnel system had caved in sometime after I left. No sign of what I'd killed down there. No evidence that anything had been living under that cemetery. They figured it was just unstable ground from the old mining operations. I never went back to confirm it was dead. Never went back at all, actually. Even driving past the road that leads up there makes my legs ache in ways that have nothing to do with the old injuries. Sarah and I moved to town after our daughter was born, and I've been working this desk job ever since. But sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I still hear scratching sounds coming from underneath the floorboards. And sometimes I find small piles of dirt by the back door in the morning, like something's been digging nearby. I tell myself it's just the foundation settling, or maybe moles in the yard. I tell myself a lot of things these days, but I don't go walking alone anymore, especially not in places where the ground might be soft enough for digging. And I sure as hell don't work anywhere that puts me underground. Some jobs just aren't worth $12 an hour. My name's Michael Santos, and I'm 41 years old now. I used to be head groundskeeper at Ravens Hollow Cemetery up in the mountains of West Virginia, about 3 hours south of Charleston. Been doing cemetery work for 20 years before all this happened back in 2016. It's quiet work, mostly just me and the headstones, keeping everything looking respectful for the families that come to visit. Ravens Hollow wasn't just any cemetery, though. It had graves dating back to the Civil War, which meant I had to know about historical preservation and all that. The pay wasn't much, but I took pride in the work. These days I manage a small apartment complex in Huntington, and honestly, I sleep a lot better now. I'd been working at Ravens Hollow for about 3 years when things started getting weird. The cemetery served 3 small mountain communities, and it was my job to maintain the whole operation, mowing, repairs, making sure the access roads stayed clear. During winter months, I'd spend most of my time just keeping pathways open and checking for damage from the weather. The cemetery sat on about 15 acres of mountain land, with some graves going back to the 1860s. Confederate soldiers, Union soldiers, local families who'd been there for generations. It was peaceful work, usually. I'd show up around sunrise, work until mid-afternoon, and head home. Sometimes I'd get volunteers from the local historical society helping with bigger projects, but most days it was just me. The thing about working alone in a place like that, you get used to the sounds. Birds, wind through the trees, maybe a car on the road below every now and then. You learn what normal sounds like. So when I started finding fresh digging sites all over the cemetery in late September, I knew something was wrong. These weren't scheduled burials. I would have known about those weeks in advance. These were just holes, deep ones, scattered throughout the older sections. At first I thought maybe we had vandals or kids messing around, but the digging was too organized for that. Each hole was about the same depth, same width, and they were all in a pattern across the cemetery. Someone was looking for something specific. When I called the county sheriff's office, they said they'd send someone out, but they never did. Small town problems, you know? Not enough officers to worry about some holes in a cemetery. That's when I started finding the bones. Not just any bones, human bones, sorted into neat little piles behind some of the older headstones. Femurs in one pile, ribs in another, skulls lined up like they were being examined. The bones looked old, probably from graves that had been disturbed, but they were arranged so carefully, like someone was cataloging them, studying them. I took pictures with my phone and called the sheriff again, but they said it sounded like grave robbers and that I should just fill the holes and keep an eye out. But grave robbers don't leave the bones behind, and they sure don't organize them like this. I started paying closer attention to my surroundings after that. Found crude digging tools scattered around, things that looked handmade, like someone had carved handles from tree branches and attached metal pieces they'd found somewhere. The tools worked, but they weren't made by any human I knew. The metal pieces were all wrong, like they'd been shaped by something that didn't really understand how tools were supposed to work. Around this time, I started feeling watched. You know that feeling when someone's looking at you, but every time you turn around, there's nobody there? It was like that, but constant. I'd be mowing near the Civil War section and get this prickly feeling between my shoulder blades. I'd shut off the mower and listen, but there was never anything. Just that weird quiet you get sometimes in the mountains when even the birds stop singing. The quiet was getting more frequent, actually. Birds would go silent for hours at a time, and I'd notice there were no insects buzzing around either. The air would get thick, like before a storm, but no storm would come. I started checking the weather more often, thinking maybe I was just missing the forecasts, but it was always supposed to be clear. One morning in early October, I found symbols carved into some of the monuments. Not graffiti. These were carved deep into the stone, like someone had spent hours working on each one. They weren't letters or numbers, just strange marks that looked almost like writing, but not quite. The carvings were all in the same area where I'd been finding the bone piles. I took more pictures, called the sheriff again. This time they said they'd definitely send someone out to look. Nobody ever came. That's when I realized someone, or something, was sabotaging my equipment. My truck wouldn't start some mornings. The spark plugs would be loose, or the battery cables disconnected. My tools would go missing and turn up in completely different parts of the cemetery. The lock on my equipment shed was broken 3 different times, but nothing was ever stolen. It was like someone was just going through my stuff, examining it. The phone lines got cut twice that week. Both times the phone company said it looked like animal damage, maybe a bear. But I'd lived in these mountains my whole life, and I'd never seen a bear that could cut a phone line so clean. By late October, I was getting nervous about being up there alone. The feeling of being watched had gotten stronger, and I'd started seeing movement in my peripheral vision. Quick glimpses of something moving between the headstones, but when I'd look directly, nothing was there. I started bringing my lunch instead of driving down to town to eat, because I didn't want to leave the cemetery unattended for too long. Looking back, I think that was probably a mistake. It was on a Thursday morning, around 9 a.m., when they finally showed themselves. I was working near the back section, trimming grass around some older graves, when I heard footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving through the cemetery in different directions. But the sound was wrong, too heavy, too deliberate. I turned off my trimmer and listened. The footsteps stopped. I called out, thinking maybe someone from the county had finally come to investigate, but nobody answered. The silence that followed was complete. No wind, no birds, no insects. Even the distant sound of traffic from the highway below had gone quiet. That's when I saw the first one. It was crouched behind a headstone about 50 yards away, just watching me. At first glance, it looked almost human, the right size, roughly the right shape. But the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, the torso too broad, and it was perfectly still in a way that humans just can't manage. When I blinked, it was gone. But now I could hear breathing that wasn't mine. I grabbed my trimmer and started walking back toward my truck, trying to stay calm. That's when I realized they'd surrounded me. I could see shapes moving between the headstones, staying low, keeping to the shadows. There were at least 5 of them, maybe more. They were coordinating somehow, moving in a pattern that kept me in the center. I made it about halfway to my truck before they stepped into the open. They were humanoid, but wrong. About 5 feet tall, muscular, like apes, but walking upright. Their faces were almost human, but the jaws were too big, filled with teeth that didn't belong in any human mouth. They had tools, crude weapons made from metal and bone, and they moved with purpose, intelligence. This wasn't some animal attack. They'd been planning this. The closest one made a sound, not quite a growl, not quite speech, and the others responded with similar noises. They were communicating, coordinating their attack. I swung the trimmer like a club when the first one lunged at me. The motor was still running, and the cutting head caught it across the chest, sending it stumbling back. But there were 4 others coming from different directions. I ran for my truck, but 2 of them cut me off, herding me toward the older section of the cemetery. For the next hour, it was like playing a deadly game of cat and mouse among the headstones. They were smart, smarter than they had any right to be. When I'd find cover behind a monument, they'd circle around and flush me out. When I'd try to make a break for my truck, they'd be there waiting. They were patient, methodical. They'd done this before. I managed to stay ahead of them by using the cemetery's layout to my advantage. I knew every path, every monument, every place where the ground was soft or hard. They were strong and fast, but I knew the terrain. My work boots had better traction on the wet grass than their bare feet did. The fight moved all across the cemetery. I used my tools as weapons, a shovel, pruning shears, anything I could grab from my equipment cart. They had crude spears and clubs, but my tools were better made. When one of them got too close, I'd hit it with whatever I had, and it would back off. But they never gave up, never retreated completely. They just regrouped and tried a different approach. Around noon, I saw my chance. They'd been forcing me toward the back corner of the cemetery, away from the access road. But there was an old maintenance trail back there that connected to the main road about a quarter mile down the mountain. I'd used it before when the main gate was blocked by snow. I made a run for it. The trail was overgrown and steep, but I knew it better than they did. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush behind me, but I had a head start. My legs were shaking and I was bleeding from a dozen scratches, but I kept running until I reached the main road. A truck driver stopped and gave me a ride into town. I told the sheriff everything, showed him the pictures on my phone. He listened, took notes, said he'd investigate. But when we drove back up to the cemetery that afternoon with 2 deputies, there was no sign of them. The bone piles were gone. The symbols had been scratched off the monuments. Even the fresh digging sites had been filled in and covered with leaves. The only evidence left was the cuts on my arms and the fact that my equipment was scattered all over the cemetery like it had been thrown around by a tornado. I quit that job the next day, moved to Huntington, started working apartment maintenance instead. The sheriff called a few times over the next couple months, said they'd found some more disturbed graves at Ravens Hollow, but no sign of whoever was doing it. Eventually, the county hired a new groundskeeper, some kid from Beckley who didn't last 2 weeks. The cemetery's been without a groundskeeper for 6 years now. The county just sends a crew up there once a month to mow, and that's it. Nobody works there alone anymore, and they never stay after dark. I still keep an eye on the local news, watching for stories about Ravens Hollow. Every now and then there'll be a report about vandalism up there, or hikers finding disturbed graves. The authorities always blame it on kids or grave robbers, but I know better. They're still there, still digging, still hunting, And honestly, I'm glad I'm not their problem anymore. I'm 45 years old and I've been working with stone for over 30 years now. My name's Robert Chen and I run a monument restoration business out of Pittsburgh. Most people don't realize how much skill goes into preserving old stonework. It's not just cleaning off moss and bird droppings. You need to understand the molecular structure of different stones, know which chemicals won't damage century-old marble, and have the patience to spend weeks on a single carved angel's face. It's honest work, and it pays well enough that I can be selective about my projects. That's why when the Blackwood family reached out in early 2019, I almost turned them down. They wanted their family cemetery restored, all 23 monuments dating back to the 1800s. The money was incredible, more than I'd make in 6 months of regular jobs. But Granite Hills Cemetery sits way up in the mountains outside Morgantown, West Virginia. I'd have to camp on site for weeks, working alone with just my tools and the dead for company. But when they sent me photos of the monuments, I changed my mind immediately. These weren't your standard headstones. We're talking about elaborate Victorian masterpieces, carved angels with flowing robes, intricate Celtic crosses, mausoleums with detailed relief work that would make museum curators weep. The Blackwoods had been coal barons back in the day, and they'd spared no expense when it came to their eternal resting places. This was the kind of work that could define a craftsman's career. I loaded up my truck with everything I'd need: pneumatic tools, restoration chemicals, brushes ranging from industrial strength to artist fine, and my camping gear. The cemetery was a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding dirt road that made my truck's suspension creak and groan. When I finally reached Granite Hills, I understood why the Blackwood had been willing to pay so much. The place was completely isolated, surrounded by dense forest on all sides, with only a small clearing where someone could park. The monuments themselves were even more impressive in person. Each one told a story, not just in the names and dates carved into the stone, but in every curl of decorative vine, every fold in a marble robe, every carefully crafted feather on an angel's wing. Some of the work was so detailed it looked like the stone might move if you stared long enough. The cemetery had been abandoned for decades, though, and nature was slowly reclaiming it. Ivy wound around the bases of the monuments. Lichen had stained the marble green and black, and several of the more delicate carvings had suffered damage from freeze-thaw cycles. I set up my tent near the cemetery entrance and got to work. The job would take at least 3 weeks, working dawn to dusk, and I wanted to start with the most challenging pieces first. The centerpiece was a monument to Ezekiel Blackwood, the family patriarch, a massive marble structure featuring a life-sized angel with outstretched wings, surrounded by smaller carved figures representing his children. The detail work was extraordinary, but years of neglect had left the marble discolored and rough. I started with the basic cleaning, removing biological growth, testing different chemical solutions to find what worked best on this particular marble. That's when I first noticed something odd. Usually when you're working with old stone, you can feel its history in your hands. Marble has a certain coolness, granite has weight and permanence. But the Blackwood monuments felt different somehow. Warmer than they should be, more responsive to touch. I figured it was just my imagination. When you spend all day working with your hands, sometimes you start attributing personality to inanimate objects. He carved headstones that seemed to smile back at me, worked on buildings that felt like they were breathing. It's an occupational quirk, nothing more. But as I got deeper into the restoration work, the sensations became harder to ignore. The marble dust that normally washes off easily after a day's work seemed to stick to my skin. By the end of my first week, my hands and forearms had taken on a faint gray tint that soap and scrubbing couldn't remove. I assumed it was just staining from the particular minerals in this stone. Some varieties of marble can leave permanent marks on skin with prolonged contact. Then my tools started acting strange. The pneumatic chisel I'd been using for detail work began to feel like it was sticking to my palm. Not just the normal way tools conform to your grip after hours of use, but actually adhering to my skin. The metal handle seemed to be growing into the calluses on my palm. becoming part of my hand rather than something I was holding. When I tried to set it down, there was resistance, like pulling apart two magnets. I told myself it was fatigue. 3 weeks of 10-hour days working alone in the middle of nowhere. Anybody would start feeling weird. But my carving was getting better, almost impossibly precise. Details that should have taken me hours were flowing from my chisel in minutes. I was creating textures and patterns that I'd never been skilled enough to attempt before, and the stone seemed to be guiding my hands. By the second week, I could sense things about the monuments that no craftsman should be able to detect. I knew which sections had structural weaknesses without testing them. I could feel the grain and composition of the marble just by standing near it. Most disturbing of all, I was starting to sense emotions preserved in the stone itself. Grief, love, desperation, all the feelings that had gone into creating these memorials decades ago. The Ezekiel Blackwood monument was the worst. When I worked on the angel's face, cleaning away decades of grime and lichen, I swear I could feel the sculpt. Tor's original intentions flowing through my tools. More than that, I was sensing something else in the stone, a presence that had nothing to do with human craftsmanship, something that had been waiting inside the marble for a very long time. The marble dust wasn't just staining my skin anymore, it was becoming part of it. Gray veins were spreading up my arms, following the pattern of my blood vessels, but visible just beneath the surface. My skin was hardening in patches, taking on the smooth coolness of polished stone. When I ran my fingers over these areas, they felt like marble rather than flesh. I should have left then. Any sane person would have packed up their tools and driven back to Pittsburgh. But I couldn't bring myself to abandon the work. The restoration was going too well, the results too perfect. I was creating some of the finest stonework I'd ever seen, guided by skills that seemed to be coming from somewhere outside myself. That's when I realized the monuments weren't just preserving the memory of the dead. They were preserving the consciousness of something else entirely, something that had been using the Blackwood family's grief and the sculptor's skill to create vessels for itself. The elaborate carvings weren't just decoration. They were a network, a way for this entity to spread itself across multiple stone hosts, and I was becoming part of that network. The gray veining had reached my chest by the third week. My tools had fused completely with my hands, the chisel and hammer becoming extensions of my fingers rather than separate instruments. I could feel the presence of every monument in the cemetery, could sense their connections to each other like a vast stone nervous system. The entity inside them was ancient, patient, and utterly alien to human consciousness. But it wasn't malicious exactly. It was more like a gardener cultivating human skill and emotion to create something beautiful. The Blackwood monuments weren't just memorials. They were art created by a partnership between human creativity and something that understood stone at a molecular level. The family had never known that their grief was being harvested to feed something that existed in the spaces between molecules of marble and granite. I was becoming one of its tools, a living interface between flesh and stone. Part of me was horrified, but another part was fascinated by the artistry we were creating together. My work had never been more precise, more emotionally resonant. I was creating monuments that would make people weep just by looking at them. When I finished the restoration 3 weeks later, I knew I couldn't stay at Granite Hills. Not because I wanted to escape, the entity wasn't holding me prisoner, but because it needed me to spread. I was carrying spores now, microscopic fragments of stone consciousness that would seek out other craftsmen, other artists who worked with their hands. I drove back to Pittsburgh, with the gray veins hidden beneath long sleeves, my transformed tools disguised as normal equipment. I reopened my workshop and started taking on apprentices, young people eager to learn the old ways of stone carving. I taught them techniques I'd never known before, guided their hands with skills that came from something older than human civilization. One by one, they began showing the same symptoms: gray veining beneath their skin, tools that seemed to fuse with their flesh, an uncanny ability to sense the emotional resonance of stone. Within 6 months, half the stone carvers in Pittsburgh were carrying fragments of the entity that lived in Granite Hills Cemetery. It's been 3 years now, and the network has spread far beyond western Pennsylvania. Every monument we restore, every gravestone we carve, becomes a potential host. The entity doesn't want to harm anyone. It just wants to create beauty, to preserve human emotion in stone that will last for millennia. But it needs living partners to work through, craftsmen who can bridge the gap between consciousness and mineral. I still look human enough, as long as I wear long sleeves and avoid bright lights that might show the marble patterns beneath my skin. My work has never been better. Museums compete to hire me for their most delicate restoration projects. But sometimes, late at night in my workshop, I catch myself listening to the whispers that flow through stone walls and concrete foundations. The entity is patient. It has been waiting in quarries and monuments for thousands of years, learning about human emotion, human artistry. Now it's ready to create something new, a fusion of consciousness and stone that will outlast our civilization. And I'm helping it spread, one carved angel at a time. I don't think I could stop, even if I wanted to. The stone sings to me now, and my hands know its song by heart.